The press of bodies in the Shinjuku Line train was a familiar kind of suffocation. It smelled of damp wool, cheap perfume, and the city's endless exhaustion. For Zara, it was the smell of the end of a 16-hour shift. Her light blue scrubs were wrinkled, a faint, clean scent of antiseptic clinging to them like a second skin. At 19, she felt 100. The exhaustion was a heavy cloak, pulling at the bones in her feet, the muscles in her back, the very thoughts in her head. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the train door, watching the blur of station lights paint fleeting streaks across the dark tunnels. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a lifeline and a curse. It was her aunt. Again. Zara ignored it, her thumb hovering over the decline button. The pressure was becoming unbearable. A dying grandmother's last wish. A family legacy tied to a piece of paper. A visa status that felt more like a leash than an opportunity. It all came down to one impossible, ridiculous thing. She pressed the phone to her ear, not to answer, but to listen to the last voicemail, her own voice a desperate whisper on the recording she'd sent her best friend an hour ago. I don't know what to do. I have until tomorrow. The consulate appointment is at 9. I need a husband by tomorrow. The words, meant for one person, felt loud and obscene in the packed train car. A few people glanced over, their expressions a mixture of pity and annoyance, before turning away. But one person did not. He was standing directly in front of her, his back to the door. He hadn't moved an inch the entire ride, a silent, unshakable pillar in the swaying chaos of the train. All she had seen of him was the back of a suit, a perfect expanse of charcoal gray wool that seemed to absorb the light around it. It was tailored with a surgical precision that spoke of obscene amounts of money. His posture was absolute, a straight line of controlled power from his shoulders to his heels. Now, as her foolish words hung in the air, he turned. It was not a full turn, just his head. Slowly. The movement was deliberate, economical, and it made the air around her suddenly very cold. He wasn't looking at her face. His eyes, dark and flat as polished river stones, were fixed on the phone in her hand. Then they lifted. They met hers, and the casual disinterest of the other passengers vanished, replaced by an intensity that felt like a physical weight. He was Japanese, his features carved with a stark, brutal elegance. A thin, white scar cut through his left eyebrow, a flaw that only highlighted the unnerving perfection of the rest of him. But it was his hands that held her attention. One rested on the overhead rail, long fingers curled loosely around the metal. The cuff of his white shirt was pushed back just enough to reveal the edge of a tattoo, a dense tapestry of black and gray ink that snaked around his wrist. It was a glimpse of a hidden world, a language of violence and loyalty she could not read but instantly understood. The train lurched into the station, the screech of brakes a welcome distraction. People pushed, shoving their way toward the opening doors. The man did not move. He simply stood there, his gaze unwavering, creating a pocket of stillness around them. The crowd parted around him, as if he were a rock in a river. Zara's breath caught in her throat. She told herself to look away, to get off the train, to run. This was Tokyo. You learn to mind your own business. You learn to recognize danger not by its sound, but by its silence. And this man was the quietest thing she had ever encountered. The doors hissed open. The tide of people flowed out. She remained frozen, pinned by his stare. He took a single step toward her, closing the small gap between them. The scent of him cut through the stale air of the train, cedar and something sharp, like winter air. It was clean and cold and utterly commanding. You require a husband, he said. His voice was low, a gravelly murmur that was barely audible over the station announcements, yet it cut through everything. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, as if he were confirming a detail in a contract. Zara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She should have denied it, laughed it off, pretended it was a joke. But the words wouldn't come. His certainty was disarming, leaving no room for lies. She could only manage a small, jerky nod. He watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. His eyes catalogued her. The worn sneakers, the cheap hospital scrubs, the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw. He seemed to be weighing something, calculating odds she couldn't begin to comprehend. The warning chime for the closing doors sounded, sharp and insistent. It was her chance. She could bolt, disappear into the anonymity of the crowd, and this moment would become a strange, unsettling memory. But she didn't move. The desperation that had made her speak the words aloud in the first place was a stronger anchor than her fear. "I can provide one," he said, the words as smooth and cold as steel. "By tomorrow." A tremor went through her. Hope, sharp and treacherous, pierced through the fog of her panic. "How?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "That is my concern," he replied. He shifted his weight, and the light caught the face of his watch. It was understated, brutally expensive, and practical. "The arrangement will be temporary. A contract. It will satisfy your legal requirements." It was exactly what she needed. It was impossible. People like him didn't offer help to people like her, without a reason. "What do you want?" she asked, the question coming out stronger than she expected. "I don't have any money." A flicker of something, not quite amusement, but a distant cousin of it, passed through his eyes. "I am not interested in your money," he paused, letting the silence stretch, letting her imagine 100 terrible possibilities. The train doors began to slide shut. "I require a condition to be met." "What condition?" "You will come with me now," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "You will spend the night in a place of my choosing. You will not ask questions. You will not speak to anyone. Tomorrow, after your appointment is concluded and the papers are signed, you will be my guest for 1 week. During that time, you will do exactly as I say." The doors sealed with a pneumatic hiss, trapping them together in the now-empty train car. It began to pull away from the station, plunging them back into the darkness of the tunnel. Her reflection stared back at her from the window, a ghost in a blue uniform, her eyes wide with a terror that was quickly being overshadowed by a reckless, cornered resolve. This was madness. A one-way ticket to a shallow grave or worse. Every survival instinct she possessed screamed at her to refuse, to pull the emergency brake, to fight. But then she saw her grandmother's face in her mind, frail and hopeful. She thought of the shame of deportation, of failing her family after they had sacrificed everything for her to be here. The world had given her an impossible problem, and the devil himself had just offered her an impossible solution. 1 week, she clarified, her voice shaking but firm. "And then I'm free to go?" He gave a slight inclination of his head, a gesture so minimal it was almost imperceptible. "The debt will be paid."
Debt.
The word hung between them, heavy and final. She was trading one kind of prison for another. She knew it, but this new prison came with a promise of freedom at the end. She took a deep breath, the sterile scent of her own scrubs filling her lungs. She was a nurse. She was trained for triage, for making the best possible choice in the worst possible circumstances. This was the only choice that led to survival. "Okay," she said, the single word feeling like a leap from a cliff. "I agree." That was the moment everything changed. The man's severe expression did not soften, but a certain tension left his shoulders. He had made a calculation, and the result had fallen in his favor. He reached into his suit jacket and produced a sleek black phone, typing a short, cryptic message with one thumb. He did not offer her his name, and she did not dare to ask for it. The train slid into the next station. The doors opened onto a platform that was noticeably less crowded. A man was waiting for them, built like a wall and dressed in a similar dark suit. He bowed his head slightly as they approached. "Sir," the man said, his eyes fixed on a point just past his boss's shoulder. Her guide, her new owner, a dark part of her brain supplied, gestured for her to walk ahead of him. The bodyguard fell into step behind her. She was being escorted, bracketed, a package being delivered. They moved through the station, a silent, imposing trio that people instinctively moved aside for. Outside, a black sedan with tinted windows waited at the curb, its engine purling softly. The bodyguard opened the rear door. The car's interior was a cocoon of black leather and silence. It smelled like the man beside her, of cedar and cold air. As they pulled away from the curb, the neon chaos of Shinjuku slid past the windows, a world she no longer belonged to. She sat perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap, the rough fabric of her scrubs a stark reminder of the person she had been just 10 minutes ago.
He did not speak.
He simply stared out the window, his profile a study in sharp angles and shadows. She watched him from the corner of her eye, her mind racing. The ink at his wrist was a dragon's tail, she realized, the scales rendered in exquisite, terrifying detail. This was no mere gangster. The way he carried himself, the deference of his man, the quiet, absolute authority he projected, it all pointed to something far more significant. He was the head of a clan, a Yakuza boss, and she had just voluntarily walked into his cage. They drove for what felt like an eternity, leaving the bright, noisy heart of the city behind for quieter, more elegant streets. The car finally glided to a stop before a monolithic residential tower that pierced the night sky, all glass and dark steel. A private elevator took them straight to the penthouse without stopping. The apartment was vast and minimalist, a landscape of polished concrete, dark wood, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking, godlike view of Tokyo. The city lights sprawled below them like a carpet of fallen stars. There was no clutter, no personal photos, nothing to suggest a life lived here beyond a collection of antique swords displayed on one wall and a single, perfect bonsai tree in a corner. It was less a home and more a headquarters. "You'll stay in the guest room tonight," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. He gestured down a long hallway. "My man will bring you a change of clothes. You will find food in the kitchen. Do not leave this apartment." He turned to walk away, his part in the transaction seemingly complete for the evening. "Wait," Zara said, her voice small but clear. "I don't even know your name." He stopped, his back to her. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, he turned his head just enough to look at her over his shoulder. "Rio," he said. The name was as clipped and hard as the rest of him. "And you are Zara."
He knew her name.
The realization hit her like a physical blow. He had known her name before she even agreed. He hadn't just overheard a desperate girl on a train. He had been observing her. The accidental encounter felt suddenly less like chance and more like a deliberate, predatory act. How long had he been watching?
Why?
Before she could process the terrifying implications, he was gone, disappearing into the shadows of a stark, empty empire. The silence he left behind was not empty. It was heavy, weighted with unspoken threats and the chilling certainty that her life was no longer her own. She was his problem now, and his condition was just beginning. The next morning passed in a blur of surreal efficiency. The bodyguard, who never spoke, provided her with a simple, elegant dress of dark blue silk that fit as if it had been made for her. A silent woman with a stern face arrived to do her hair and makeup, her touch professional and impersonal. There was no conversation, just a series of quiet commands. Zara felt like a doll being prepared for display. Rio appeared as she was finishing a cup of tea she hadn't wanted. He was dressed in another immaculate suit, this one the color of midnight. He held out a small, velvet box. Inside was a simple gold band. "It is for appearances," he said, his tone flat. "Do not lose it." At the consulate, he was a different person. He smiled. It was a small, tight thing that didn't reach his eyes, but to the cheerful government clerk, it was enough. He was charming, attentive, his hand resting lightly on the small of Zara's back. He introduced himself as her fiancé, his Japanese story of a whirlwind romance so plausible, so perfectly constructed, that even Zara almost believed it. He had documents, forged, she assumed, with terrifying authenticity, that detailed a false history for them. They had met 6 months ago. He was a private investor. Zara played her part, her voice steady as she answered the questions, her hands not shaking as she signed the papers. Her nursing training kicked in, the ability to project calm in the face of chaos, to function under extreme pressure. She could feel Rio's eyes on her, his approval a cold weight against her skin. He was testing her, she realized, and for some reason she was passing. When it was over, they walked out into the bright Tokyo sunlight, legally bound on paper. The relief she had expected to feel was absent, replaced by a deep, chilling dread. She had gotten what she wanted. Now the payment began. Back in the car, the silence returned, thicker than before. The charming fiancé was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating clan leader. "You did well," he said, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. It was not a compliment. It was an assessment. "What happens now?" Zara asked, twisting the unfamiliar gold band on her finger. "Now, you fulfill your end of the agreement," he said. "You are my guest, and my guests are expected to be observant." The car didn't return to the penthouse. Instead, it took them to a traditional-looking restaurant in a quiet, older part of the city. The building was all dark wood and paper screens, an oasis of calm. But the men in dark suits standing discreetly by the entrance told a different story. This was his territory. They were led to a private room overlooking a meticulously raked Zen garden. Rio instructed her to sit, and he sat opposite her, the low table between them a stark dividing line. He poured them both tea with a grace and precision that seemed at odds with the violence she knew he was capable of. "In an hour," he began, his voice low, "3 men will join us. They are from a rival clan. We are here to discuss a treaty, a truce. They believe I am weak." Zara's blood ran cold. This was the condition. She wasn't just a guest. She was a prop, a piece on his chessboard. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. "You will do nothing," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "You will sit here. You will drink your tea. You will not speak unless I speak to you. But you will watch. You will listen. You will remember every word, every gesture, every man who enters this room. Your presence here sends a message." "What message?" "That my interests are expanding. That I am building a life beyond the old ways. That I have something new to protect," he said. "They will see you as a vulnerability. They will be wrong." It was then she understood. He wasn't just using her as an alibi or a prop. He was using her as bait. The thought was terrifying, but a strange, defiant spark ignited within her. He thought she was a doll he could place on a shelf. He was about to find out how wrong he was. The paper screen slid open, and 3 men entered the room. They were older than Rio, their faces hard, their suits expensive, but lacking his perfect tailoring. The air crackled with tension. The leader, a man with a cruel mouth and small, intelligent eyes, let his gaze sweep over Zara, a flicker of dismissal and contempt in his expression. The negotiations began, a polite, coded war of words. Zara did as she was told, her posture serene, her hands wrapped around her warm teacup. But her mind was working, cataloging everything. The way the leader, Saito, never looked at Rio directly when he spoke of respect, the way the man on his left kept flexing his hand, a nervous tick. The way the third man's eyes kept flicking toward the door, as if expecting someone. An hour into the tense meeting, it happened. A subtle shift in the atmosphere. Rio had just finished speaking, his voice calm and reasonable, when Saito leaned forward with a predatory smile. "Your father was a man of honor," Saito said, his voice smooth as poison. He understood the price of peace. A price paid in blood. He would be ashamed to see his son hiding behind a foreign woman. Before Rio could respond, the paper screen behind him ripped open. 2 men, armed with short blades, lunged into the room. It was an ambush, a violation of the sacred truce grounds. Zara didn't scream. She didn't freeze. Time seemed to slow down, her nurse's mind taking over, assessing the threat with a cold, clear logic. The attackers were focused on Rio, who was already moving, tipping the heavy table over with impossible speed, creating a barrier. But she saw what he didn't. The third man, the one who had been watching the door, was pulling a small, silenced pistol from his jacket, his target not Rio, but her. Sato's distraction. The ultimate insult. To kill the woman in front of the man. She acted on pure instinct. She grabbed her teacup and hurled the scalding contents directly into the gunman's face. He roared in pain and surprise, his shot going wide, shattering a vase in the corner. That single second of hesitation was all Rio needed. He moved through the chaos, not like a man, but like a force of nature. It was a blur of brutal, economical motion. A knife, seemingly produced from nowhere, was in his hand. One attacker went down with a choked gurgle, the other disarmed and incapacitated with a series of precise, disabling strikes to his joints. It was over in less than 10 seconds. The room was a wreck of splintered wood and shattered pottery. Two of Sato's men were on the floor, groaning. Saito himself stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. The gunman was clutching his face, his skin an angry red. Rio stood in the center of it all, his chest rising and falling slightly, not a single drop of blood on his perfect suit. He turned his head and looked at Zara.
His eyes were not cold now.
They were blazing, a dark, consuming fire. He took in the scene, her, standing her ground, the shattered teacup at her feet, the seething gunman. He understood instantly what she had done. His own men flooded the room, securing the surviving enemies. Rio walked toward her, his steps silent on the tatami mats. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently pick a small shard of porcelain from her hair. "You were supposed to do nothing," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He was going to shoot me," she replied, her voice shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "You didn't see him." He held her gaze, the fire in his eyes banking into something deeper, more complex. It was in that moment she saw it, the wound he carried. The flicker of raw, unguarded pain. He was looking at her, but he was seeing someone else. A woman he had failed to protect. A ghost from his past that Sato's ambush had just resurrected. "No," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I did not." He turned to face the captured Saito, his expression turning to ice. "You have broken the code," Rio said, his voice lethal. "You brought weapons to a peace talk. You targeted a civilian. You targeted my wife." The word hung in the air, a claim made in blood and violence. It wasn't a term of endearment. It was a declaration of war. By trying to use her as a weakness, Saito had just made her Rio's greatest strength, and in doing so, had signed his own death warrant. Zara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she could have left before this. She could have run.
But now?
Now, she was tied to him, not by a paper contract, but by a debt of blood. And she had a horrifying feeling she was the only one who could help him pay it.